Clara Dawson had always believed she understood danger. She had grown up on the edge of Arizona territory where dust storms, rattlesnakes, and stray bullets from wandering drifters were common enough that a person learned to keep their guard up. But nothing prepared her for the day the Apache took her during a border clash that erupted far faster than anyone expected. One moment she had been gathering water near the creek beside her family's ranch, and the next she was being pulled onto a paint horse by a warrior with black hair streaming behind him like a banner in the wind. Fear was a living thing inside her as they rode. She had heard stories all her life. Stories whispered by neighbors and traveling cowhands who spoke of raids and disappearances and how captives never returned. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought the warrior must surely hear it. Yet the man holding her did not strike her or shout. Instead, he held her steady in front of him, guiding the horse as if he feared she might fall. When they entered the Apache camp, Clara braced herself for cruelty. The men gathered around her with sharp eyes and sharper weapons, and she waited for the moment someone would decide her fate. But the warrior who had taken her tightened his grip on her arm and said something in Apache that made the others step back. He guided her to a shaded corner near a cluster of low-built shelters and motioned for her to sit. His gestures were firm but not unkind, and she followed. Because she had no other choice, she expected to be tied or guarded by several men. Instead, only one remained, the same warrior who had brought her. There was something unsettling about the quiet way he studied her, not with anger, but with a strange carefulness, as if he were trying to understand her fear. He wore a necklace of carved bone, his clothes made of soft deerskin, and his face held no cruelty, only watchfulness. Clara did not sleep that first night. Every sound made her flinch, every shadow reminded her she was alone with people who had every reason to hate her. When dawn finally broke, she found herself sitting with her back to the shelter wall, her hands trembling from exhaustion. She looked up at the sound of footsteps, and there he was again, the warrior, approaching with something in his hands, knelt silently in front of her, and placed a small woven basket on the ground. Inside was a piece of warm flatbread and a wooden cup filled with milk. It was simple food, but something about the way he offered it made her pause. She stared at him, expecting some sign of mockery, but instead he only nodded once, then stepped back, giving her space. Hunger and fear battled inside her. Her stomach won. She ate slowly, watching him. All the sins battled inside her. Her stomach won. She ate slowly, watching him. All the femness, while expecting the kindness to reveal itself as a trick, but nothing changed. He remained a few steps away, his arms folded across his chest, not threatening, merely present. A guard, yes, but something more too. Something gentler than she had ever imagined. Every day after that, he brought her the same meal in the quiet early hours before the camp fully woke. He never spoke, not in English anyway. Yet he always set the basket down with the same careful motion, as if he wished her to know she was safe as long as he was near. It was confusing, far more confusing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty she could understand. Kindness from a warrior she knew only as her captor left her unsure of everything she thought she knew. She wondered about his name, wondered about the reason he was the one watching over her, wondered if there was some rule or tradition she did not understand. Still, she kept her distance. She did not thank him, could not bring herself to speak to him. Her throat tightened every time he appeared, and she hated that fear still ruled her reactions. There was a part of her that believed showing trust might mark her as weak, and weakness was a dangerous thing in a place where she had no power. But another part of her, deeper, quieter, began to notice things she had missed at first, how he always placed himself between her and the rougher warriors, how he never allowed anyone to approach too closely, how he watched her not like a man studying an enemy, but like a man making sure she still breathed after the long, cruel night. It was not what she expected of captivity. It was not what anyone back home would believe. And as the days passed, Clara began to feel the first fragile crack in her fear, a single thought she tried not to think, but couldn't fully push away. Maybe he was not the monster she had always been taught to fear. Clara had been in the Apache camp for nearly a week when she realized something she should have noticed sooner: the warrior who brought her bread and milk each morning was not simply watching her, he was protecting her. Each day he stayed near her shelter, never more than a few steps away, and always positioned so that his body stood between her and the rest of the camp she tried to ignore. At first, her mind kept insisting that nothing he did mattered because she was still a captive, because kindness from an enemy could not erase the fact that she was not free. But the longer she watched him, the more she felt that something unspoken was happening around her, something quiet and patient like water shaping stone. The camp was full of noise most mornings: men sharpening blades, horses snorting firewood, cracking women grinding corn and tending children. But around Clara, a strange bubble of calm existed. Only one man controlled the boundaries of that quiet, and she began to understand how intentional it was. One morning, a group of young warriors passed too close to her. They were laughing and speaking loudly, and one of them stared at her longer than she liked before she could retreat into her shelter. The man who guarded her stepped forward, his presence cut through their noise like a blade. His arms were loose at his sides, but his stance was unmistakable. He said something in a low, controlled voice, and the young men backed away quick as smoke disappearing on the wind. Clara looked at him, then really looked at him. His shoulders broad, his expression unreadable, his hair tied back with a strip of leather, a man who moved like someone born to war but carried himself with a restraint she had not expected. He glanced at her only long enough to confirm she was unhurt, then returned to his place near the entrance of her shelter. Someone back home might have said he was claiming her. The thought frightened her so much she pressed a hand over her heart, trying to steady its pounding, but another thought crept in. One she could not stop even if she wanted to. What if he was simply guarding what he believed was his responsibility? What if protecting her brought him no pride at all, only duty? That evening she watched him from inside her shelter. While he sat carving a piece of wood, his hands were skilled, his movements slow and deliberate, his face softened when he worked, as if creating something allowed him to lower a burden he carried. At one point he lifted his eyes and their gazes collided. She braced herself, thinking he might approach. Instead he nodded once, then looked back down at his carving. Nod unsettled her more than any threat would have. A nod meant he saw her not as a problem, but as a person. It meant he acknowledged her fear and maybe even respected it. She was not ready for that. As the sun dropped behind the mountains, a cold wind swept through camp, and Clara pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The night was harsher than the day's. Loneliness crept in during the quiet hours when everyone else slept. She often lay awake longer than she should, thoughts swirling like dust in a dry canyon, wondering if anyone back home was searching for her, wondering if her father had even noticed she was missing. Her guard rarely slept. He rested sometimes, leaning against a post with one knee bent, head bowed, but his eyes never stayed shut long. If someone walked by, he lifted his chin. If a dog barked, he straightened. If the fire crackled too loudly, he turned toward her shelter as if expecting her to cry out for help. Though she never did, it was a strange comfort, one she did not want to admit to herself. She had no reason to trust him, yet he acted as if her safety was something he had sworn to keep on. The 8th day, Clara gathered her courage and spoke to him for the first time. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "Thank you." He looked up, startled, as if the thought of receiving gratitude had never crossed his mind. His dark eyes studied her, and after a long moment he touched his chest lightly and said a single word, something that sounded like Tall Wolf. His name. Clara whispered it back shyly, tasting the sound of it, and for the first time since she had been captured, the fear inside her shifted, shrinking just enough to let a sliver of something else enter, something warmer, something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to trust. By the 10th day in the Apache camp, Clara began to notice how small things could carry enormous meaning. Each morning when Tall Wolf brought her bread and milk, the smell of the warm flatbread reminded her of her mother kneading dough on the wooden table of their little farmhouse. Her fingers itched to touch it, as if by holding the bread she could reach back to a life that felt impossibly distant. The milk, warm and slightly sweet, reminded her of childhood mornings when her father would bring her a cup before school and ruffle her hair. She felt guilty for thinking of home. The camp was foreign and unpredictable, yet these memories were like tiny lanterns in a dark canyon guiding her through fear. She began to understand that the bread and milk were not just food, they were a bridge connecting her to herself in a place where everything else had been stripped away. Wolf never spoke while she ate, but sometimes he would glance at her from the corner of his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. It was not invasive. He never forced conversation. He never asked questions that might demand answers she could not give. Instead, he simply waited, keeping her in sight as she navigated her days between observation, fear, and faint relief. In quiet moments, Clara found herself remembering the ranch in vivid detail, the wooden gate squeaking as she opened it to let the cows out, the smell of hay mixed with sunlight, the river where she had learned to swim, with her brother's encouragement, her mother's soft humming. As she worked in the kitchen, the laughter and scolding all mingled together into a melody she could almost hear again. She was startled one morning when she caught herself humming that tune aloud. She froze, aware that any sound might bring attention. She had expected Tall Wolf to look annoyed or to scold her for making noise. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, almost imperceptibly, and then returned to his silent watch as if acknowledging her without judgment. Her heart lifted in a way that surprised her. Clara began to see him differently. The fear she had held tightly was still there, but now it shared space with a strange curiosity and even gratitude. She did not know if this man had ever known tenderness or if he had been taught kindness by anyone at all, but somehow he had chosen to give it to her, and in return, she could not stop thinking about home and how strange it felt to feel at all in a place she had once believed would crush her one day. While sitting on the edge of the camp, she picked up a small smooth stone she had found by the riverbed near the creek back home. She turned it over in her hands and imagined tossing it into the water and hearing it skip across the surface. 3, 4, 5 skips until it sank. She realized she had not thought about skipping stones in days, and suddenly the camp felt less suffocating. The world outside had not disappeared, and neither had she. Tall Wolf approached silently as usual and placed her basket of bread and milk on the ground. She looked up at him and felt a warmth she had not expected. Her lips moved, but no words came. She realized she wanted to tell him about the river, about her mother, about the stone she had in her hand, but she could not. The words would not have made sense here, yet he seemed to understand. Anyway, he did not need explanation that night. Clara lay on her blanket staring at the stars above the desert sky. Unlike back home, the stars were sharper, clearer, as if someone had polished the heavens while she slept. She thought of the river, of the stone, of her family, and of this man who silently offered her the simplest gestures that had begun to restore her sense of self. Each memory tied together with the unspoken care Tall Wolf had shown made her feel something she had never anticipated: safety, a fragile kind of belonging in the most unlikely of places. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe captivity did not always have to be cruel. Maybe a person could survive fear and still find pieces of home within foreign hands. Maybe kindness could come in unexpected forms. Maybe someone could care without expecting anything in return. Clara drifted into sleep with the taste of warm milk lingering on her lips and the smell of fresh bread in her mind, the memory of home mixing with the present, and a faint sense that she had begun to see Tall Wolf not just as her captor, but as the man quietly building a bridge to her heart. The desert sky had been quiet all morning, pale blue stretching endlessly, but by mid-afternoon dark clouds rolled over the canyon walls with a suddenness that made the hair on Clara's arms rise. The wind kicked up in harsh gusts, rattling the camp and sending dust swirling across the sand. She had been walking near the corral when the first sharp flashes of lightning split the sky, followed by low rumbles of thunder that shook the ground under her boots. Wolf appeared silently beside her as though he had been watching from the edge of the trees. He did not speak, only gestured toward the shelter, his dark eyes steady and unyielding. She followed without question, trusting the same hands that had fed and protected her for weeks. Already she felt the first prickles of fear creeping into her chest, but she reminded herself that he was there, always near, always vigilant. The storm hit like a living thing. Fierce and unrelenting rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the dusty ground into slick mud and sending torrents through the narrow canyon paths. The horses neighed and struggled against their tethering ropes, and warriors scrambled to secure the livestock, yet the canyon's walls funneled the water and wind in unpredictable ways, creating sudden danger spots and falling rocks. Clara's heart pounded as she realized how exposed they were, how fragile a single human body could be in such fury. Cracks split the air like a rifle shot, and a tree branch toppled near the shelter. Clara froze, unable to move as the thunder rattled her bones. Wolf reacted instantly, his hand gripping her arm and pulling her back just as another branch crashed to the ground where she had been standing. Moments like this made her pulse hammer in her ears. But in the midst of terror, there was a strange clarity in knowing he was there. He guided her down a narrow side path, leading through a small cluster of rocks where the storm's force was less brutal. He stayed close, his arm brushing against hers in a way that was almost protective, yet careful enough not to crowd her. He spoke in low tones, words she could not understand, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Stay close, follow me, trust me." She did, feeling a tremor of gratitude mingle with her fear. At one point, a sudden gust lifted her hat from her head, and it tumbled down the rocky slope. She reached for it, but the mud beneath her boots shifted dangerously. Wolf's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a strength that startled her. He steadied her and held her close for a moment, enough to steady her breathing and make her feel weightless amid the chaos. His presence was a constant anchor, the only certainty in the storm's wild, uncontrollable energy. Finally, they reached a sheltered hollow beneath an overhanging rock, a natural refuge from the rain and the wind. He arranged pieces of fallen branches to make a dry area and covered her with a buffalo hide before sitting nearby, eyes scanning the canyon entrances as if no danger could approach unnoticed. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but words failed her. She only watched, noticing the way he shifted to shield her from the worst of the storm, his jaw tight, his muscles taut with alertness. Hours passed, the storm battering the canyon walls, lightning illuminating the darkened sky and thunder echoing like cannon fire. Clara felt exhausted and small, yet strangely safe. She realized she had come to depend on this silent man, not just for the bread and milk or the protection from the camp, but for the sheer certainty of his presence, the proof that someone could care so fiercely for another without asking anything in return. When the storm finally passed, leaving a washed and shimmering landscape behind, Clara found herself trembling, not from cold but from the intensity of what had just occurred. She looked at Wolf and for the first time dared to ask in a quiet voice why he had risked himself for her. He only shook his head slightly and said something soft and low, almost a whisper that sounded like a promise rather than an explanation. She felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear now, but from a sudden recognition of how deeply someone could care. She had spent so long preparing for cruelty that kindness struck her like lightning itself, sharp, unexpected, impossible to ignore. That night, wrapped in the buffalo hide, Clara felt her heart beating differently. The storm had passed, but something within her had shifted too. She understood that fear could be tempered by trust, That danger could reveal courage in another as well as herself, and that the man she had once thought of only as her captor was quietly becoming the one she would look to in every moment of uncertainty. The morning after the storm, Clara awoke to the sun breaking through clouds that still lingered like smoke over the canyon walls. The desert smelled of wet sand and crushed sage, a scent that seemed both foreign and familiar at the same time. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and saw, as she had every morning, the small basket waiting for her at the edge of the shelter. But today it was different. There was no bread or milk. Instead, a small leather pouch rested on the soft fabric she used as a blanket. Her curiosity overcame her caution. She knelt and carefully opened the pouch. Her fingers trembling slightly, the contents took her breath away. Inside lay a delicate bracelet made of tiny colored beads. Each bead was perfectly placed, forming a pattern that mirrored the colors she had admired at sunrise: pale gold, soft red, and the faintest shade of blue like the morning sky. She held it in her hands, amazed that someone had spent time creating something so intimate and beautiful just for her. Tall Wolf stood nearby, silent as always, his eyes on her, but unreadable. Clara's chest tightened. A mix of awe, confusion, and emotion she had no name for. Her eyes filled with tears, not from fear, not from anger, but from something deeper than she had ever allowed herself to feel. She thought of her mother, of her childhood, of all the times she had been overlooked, ignored, or unloved. The bracelet was simple yet profound. It was proof that someone saw her, truly saw her, and cared enough to create something just for her. She pressed the bracelet to her lips, feeling the warmth of the leather and the smooth edges of the beads against her skin. Her hand shook as she looked up at him, searching his expression, hoping to find a clue to why he had done this. He did not speak, but the way he held himself, the subtle tilt of his head, and the steady intensity of his gaze conveyed more than words ever could. He had given her more than a gift. He had given her recognition, respect, and a silent promise that she mattered. Clara cried, not the quiet tears of fatigue or fear she had shed before, but long, unrestrained tears that carried months of loneliness, uncertainty, and longing. She felt a strange lightness, as though the weight she had carried since her capture had been lifted, even if only a little. Each bead, each careful knot in the bracelet, spoke to a patience and tenderness that was foreign to her world and to her experience of men. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to imagine something impossible: trust. She imagined speaking to him not as a captive, but as someone whose presence mattered to another human being. She imagined the possibility that kindness could exist even in a world ruled by violence, that care could exist even when it was unexpected and unasked for. She imagined the possibility that Tall Wolf had not taken her merely because she was a captive, but because he had seen her as someone worth protecting. She fastened the bracelet around her wrist carefully, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin and the symbolism in it settle against her heart. She could not speak, yet the gesture itself, accepting it, was a silent acknowledgement, a wordless thank you that no fear could silence. She realized that every piece of bread and every cup of milk, every quiet, watchful moment, had led to this gesture, and now it changed everything between them. Tall Wolf stepped back, giving her space, but Clara noticed something new in his eyes: a softness, a depth, a patient expectation that she might finally understand what he had been showing her all along. The bracelet was more than a gift. It was an offering of connection, of trust, of acknowledgement that even in the midst of danger, even in captivity, there could be moments of grace and understanding that broke the barriers between people. She looked down at her wrist, tears still falling, and whispered his name softly, almost as a prayer. Tall Wolf nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since her capture, Clara felt that the distance between them had lessened, that the bond forged through silent protection, shared fear, and now deliberate care had begun to reshape her world. She had been given something she did not expect, something that touched her soul, and she knew that from this moment forward, nothing would ever be quite the same after the gift of the bracelet. Clara felt a shift inside her she could not deny. Her fear had not vanished, but it had softened and made room for something far more complicated and unsettling. She found herself noticing Tall Wolf in ways she had never allowed before. The way his hands moved with precision when he carved wood or prepared food, the way his dark eyes scanned the horizon even in moments of quiet, and the rare, almost imperceptible smiles that flickered across his face when no one else was looking. She began to participate more in the life of the camp, helping the women with daily tasks under their watchful, but increasingly approving eyes. She learned to grind corn, braid horsehair, and carry water with a steady balance she had never mastered at home. Each small skill made her feel less like a captive and more like a part of something larger. Yet it was Tall Wolf's presence that grounded her every time she stumbled or felt unsure. He was there, silent, a shadow on the edge of her vision, a hand just out of reach to steady her if necessary. The bond between them grew in ways that defied the simplicity of words each day. Their connection was forged not through conversation but through observation, shared experiences, and the quiet understanding that needed to explain themselves fully to the other. Clara began to sense moments where he looked at her not as a captive or a stranger, but as someone whose presence had become important, necessary even in ways she did not yet comprehend. One evening, after the camp had quieted and the last embers of the fire glowed softly, Clara watched Tall Wolf approach with a basket of wild berries. He offered them to her silently, their skins glistening like tiny jewels in the firelight. She took one hesitantly and tasted its sweetness, then looked up at him. Catching the soft weight of his gaze, her heart leapt, not from fear but from something new: recognition, admiration, and an unfamiliar stir of longing that made her stomach twist and her hands tremble. She realized she wanted to speak to him, to ask questions about his life, about the world he came from, about why he had chosen to protect her, but the words would not form easily. She understood that it was not the time for words yet. It was the quietness, the shared glances, the small gestures that spoke louder than any explanation could have, and she began to notice, in moments like this, the way her pulse quickened when he came near, the way her chest felt lighter when he nodded in acknowledgement or simply remained at her side. Tall Wolf, for his part, seemed to notice the change in her as well. He began to linger slightly longer, his hands brushing hers ever so slightly as they worked side by side. He did not force intimacy, but he allowed small moments of connection to exist, each one building on the last. He began to speak a few words in a low, measured tone, teaching her the meaning of his language, not out of necessity but as an offering of inclusion, a bridge into his world. Clara felt herself responding, repeating words back to him with hesitant but growing confidence. She laughed softly when she mispronounced something, and he allowed a brief smile, a flicker of warmth, to pass between them, a human moment that felt heavier than any grand gesture of kindness. She realized that trust had grown into something more, something deeper, a fragile and powerful bond that neither could ignore. As the sun set behind the distant cliffs, casting the camp in a golden glow, Clara sat near Tall Wolf, the bracelet on her wrist glinting faintly in the fading light. She realized that she had begun to rely on him, not just for safety, but for companionship, for understanding, for the simple comfort of being seen. She had come to expect his quiet presence, and the thought of its absence made her stomach ache. In that quiet evening, with shadows stretching long and the wind whispering through the canyon, Clara understood that the walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crumble. She could not yet name the feelings, but she knew they were dangerous, thrilling, and irresistible. She had once thought captivity meant fear and loneliness, but she now understood that it could also mean connection, care, and the first stirrings of love. Tall Wolf's gaze met hers, steady, patient, and expectant. Clara felt the pull of something she had never anticipated. A force that drew her closer even as her mind warned her to resist. She leaned slightly toward him, sensing the unspoken promise in his eyes, and for the first time, allowed herself to imagine a future in which fear and longing were not enemies but partners in a bond that had begun with simple bread, milk, and the courage to care. The calm that had settled over the camp after weeks of quiet, days, and shared routines was suddenly shattered by news that reached the warriors from the distant Ridge Scouts had returned with word that the U.S. cavalry was moving through the territory, searching for the Apache and any captives in the area. Clara's heart pounded at the news, a mixture of fear, hope, and confusion twisting inside her. She had always imagined this day as the one that would decide her fate, but now that it had arrived, she felt unprepared for the choice that might come with it. Tall Wolf remained calm, as he always did, his expression steady and unreadable, yet Clara sensed the tension in his posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the careful placement of his hands when he adjusted the horses or watched the horizon. He had taught her that fear could be tempered by trust, but he had also taught her that strength sometimes meant letting others decide their own path. She wondered what he would do, whether he would fight, flee, or allow her freedom without question. When the cavalry approached the camp the next morning, Clara was offered the chance to leave with them. She was told she could return to her family, back to the world she had known before the Apache captured her, back to the life she had believed lost. The offer should have brought relief, yet it felt like a blade slicing through her chest. Her thoughts turned immediately to Tall Wolf, to the quiet meals he had brought her, to the bracelet he had made, to the protection and care he had shown with no expectation of reward. She realized that to leave him would mean abandoning the only person who had ever truly seen her, who had recognized her worth when no one else had. Clara's hand shook as she stepped forward toward the cavalry. The soldiers waited, their expressions polite but firm, ready to escort her to safety. She paused, glancing over her shoulder at Tall Wolf. He was standing a few paces away, the wind catching the edges of his deerskin shirt, his gaze steady on her face. She searched for a sign, some hint of what he wanted her to do, but his eyes revealed nothing. He offered no words, no command, no plea. He simply watched. And in that silence she understood something profound. He trusted her to make her own choice. Fear and desire warred inside her. She remembered home, the safety she had once taken for granted, the familiar faces, the warmth of her family's kitchen, the river where she had learned to swim. Yet she also remembered the days in the Apache camp, the gentle protection, the quiet patience, the bracelet that had made her cry because someone had cared enough to create something beautiful for her. She realized that she could not return to a life that had never truly protected her heart, that had never shown her what it meant to be truly seen. Her feet felt heavy, the desert ground solid beneath her boots, yet her mind was a whirlwind. She looked once more at Tall Wolf, feeling the unspoken weight of every gesture. Every day he had been near. Her chest tightened as she realized that she had already chosen. In the quietest corners of her thoughts, in the moments she could not admit aloud, in the growing stirrings of her heart, she wanted to stay. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. She saw something shift in his expression, a fleeting mixture of relief and anticipation, and her breath caught. She ran toward him, the decision already made, and felt the bracelet press against her wrist as if affirming her choice. The world around them, the cavalry, the canyon, the uncertain desert fell away, leaving only the two of them in that fragile space where fear and love intertwined. Tall Wolf reached out without hesitation, his hand steadying her as she came to a stop before him. His dark eyes softened, and for the first time, he allowed the faintest smile to cross his face. The bond that had been built through bread, milk, protection, and care had culminated in this moment. a choice that neither words nor commands could dictate, but that had been silently formed through every gesture of trust and kindness. Clara realized that freedom was not always found in returning to the world she had known. It could also be found in the choice to remain with someone who had taught her the meaning of safety, respect, and unexpected love. Her heart, once cautious and wary, now surged with certainty as she whispered his name and he took her hand, guiding her through the camp that had once been a place of fear but had become a place of belonging, of home. Clara's feet carried her across the camp as if guided by the force of her own heart. She moved past the tents, the scattered tools, and the quiet watchers, toward the man who had become the only certainty in a world that had been cruel and unpredictable. The cavalry waited, their horses restless, the men polite but firm, expecting her to return to the life that had once been hers, yet she no longer belonged there. Not fully, not after what she had discovered here in the desert. In the presence of Tall Wolf, her chest ached as she approached him, the bracelet on her wrist warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the care and attention he had shown. Her thoughts traveled through each day they had shared, each act of protection, each silent vigil, each gift small or grand that had built a bridge between them from fear to trust. From fear to the unspoken stirrings of something far deeper. She realized she could not leave him behind, could not abandon the man who had given her not just safety, but the first taste of being truly seen. Tall Wolf stepped forward to meet her, his eyes softening as she reached him. She stopped just short, searching his face, seeking reassurance, perhaps even permission. Though she had long known the answer already, her hand found his, warm, strong, steady. And in that simple touch she felt all the days of their shared time coalesce into a single undeniable truth. She belonged here, with him, and he belonged with her. The cavalry officers, recognizing the bond that had grown between them, gave subtle nods of understanding. Clara did not need their approval. She could feel the quiet strength in Tall Wolf's grip, the unspoken promise that no one would force her choice, that he would accept her decision without question. The wind swept through the canyon, rustling the edges of their clothing, and for a moment the desert seemed to hold its breath along with her. Waiting for the choice to be made final, she leaned toward him, the words she had held back for so long finally finding their place on her lips. "I choose you," she whispered, and he responded not with words but by pulling her gently closer, a hand resting at her waist, the other brushing her hair from her face. Her heart leapt in a way she had never anticipated, the pulse of fear and excitement mingling into a pure, unshakable certainty. Clara felt the weight of the world lift as she pressed her cheek to his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the solid reassurance of his presence. She thought of the bracelet, the bread, the milk, the storm, the quiet days and nights that had transformed her captivity into something far richer, something that had given her choice, dignity, and love all at once. She realized that the life she had left behind could not compare to this life she was choosing now, a life built on trust, courage, and the raw, unspoken connection that had grown between them. Tall Wolf tilted his head, allowing a faint, rare smile to appear, the kind that spoke of relief, quiet triumph, and unspoken devotion. He guided her toward the center of the camp, where the sun was breaking through the lingering clouds from the storm days before, casting the desert in golden light. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of joy and recognition, not fear or sorrow. She had chosen not just safety but love, not just protection but belonging, and the weight of that knowledge was both exhilarating and grounding. The soldiers of the cavalry watched respectfully, understanding that this was a choice beyond their reach, a bond forged in ways they could not comprehend. Tall Wolf held Clara's hand firmly as they walked together, side by side, Through the canyon that had once been a place of danger and uncertainty and was now transformed into a place of home and hope, the bracelet on her wrist caught the sunlight and shimmered, a symbol of all that had brought them to this moment. As they reached a small rise overlooking the camp, Clara looked up at tall Wolf and whispered, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and love in her voice, "Thank you." "For everything," he responded with a low hum of acknowledgement, his hand tightening around hers ever so slightly, a silent promise that whatever the future held, they would face it together. She smiled through tears, knowing that in choosing him, she had found something far greater than freedom. She had found a home in his heart and a place where hers would forever belong.